The light was fading fast over the Arkansas hills as Grace Abbott opened her eyes, the blood from her head wound still warm against her temple. She could hear the river rushing beside her, its muddy waters threatening to rise with the coming storm. It was 1875, and dying alone beside a river was not how she'd planned to meet her maker. 3 days earlier, Grace had boarded the stagecoach in Little Rock with high hopes of starting a new life as a schoolteacher in Monticello. The journey had been uneventful until bandits ambushed the coach just 20 miles from her destination. The driver and shotgun rider were killed instantly. The other passengers, a salesman, an elderly couple, and Grace, were dragged from the vehicle, robbed and beaten. She recalled the leader's cruel eyes as he'd struck her repeatedly when she refused to surrender her mother's locket. "This one's got spirit," he'd laughed to his companions. "Too much trouble to bring along. Leave her by the river. She'll be dead by morning." They dragged her semi-conscious body down to the riverbank and left her there to die. Now, as consciousness returned, the pain in her head competed with the terrible aching in her ribs. Night was coming, and with it, the howling of distant coyotes. Grace tried to sit up but collapsed back onto the mud with a moan. The storm clouds were gathering above, and the first fat raindrops began to fall on her face. She closed her eyes, thinking of her parents both taken by influenza the previous winter, and wondered if she might see them again before dawn. The sound of approaching hoofbeats barely registered through her pain. She forced her eyes open as a tall figure dismounted and approached cautiously. "Dear God," a deep voice muttered. Grace felt gentle hands examining her wounds. "Miss, can you hear me?" She managed a weak nod, wincing at the movement. The man's face came into focus, weathered and tanned beneath a wide-brimmed hat, with kind blue eyes and a strong jaw shadowed by several days' growth of beard. "Bandits?" he asked, his voice tight with anger. "Yes," she whispered. He surveyed the riverbank, then looked at the darkening sky. "Storm's coming in fast. You need shelter and a doctor." His expression softened as he looked down at her. "You're coming home with me instead of dying on this riverbank." Before Grace could protest, he carefully lifted her into his arms. Despite her pain, she noticed the gentleness of his movements as he settled her in front of him on his horse. "I'm Hank Dawson," he said, securing one arm around her waist to keep her steady. "My ranch is about 3 miles from here." "Grace Abbott," she managed. "Thank you, Mr. Dawson." "Just Hank, miss. Hold on tight now." The rain began to fall in earnest as they rode, and Hank sheltered her as best he could with his duster. Grace drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the steady heartbeat against her back and the strong arm holding her securely. By the time they reached the ranch, Grace was shivering uncontrollably. Through the rain, she caught glimpses of a modest but well-maintained homestead, a sturdy log cabin with a wide porch, a barn, and several outbuildings. A dog barked frantically as they approached. "That's just Rusty," Hank said near her ear. "He's all noise." As they reached the porch, the cabin door flew open and an older woman rushed out. "Hank Dawson. What in heaven's name, bandits, Mrs. Wilkes," Hank explained, carefully dismounting with Grace in his arms. "Found her left for dead by the river. She needs help." The woman, plump and gray-haired with a kind, weathered face, gasped. "Bring her in, quick. I'll heat water." Inside, the cabin was simply furnished but clean and warm. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the wooden walls. Hank carried Grace to a small bedroom off the main living area and gently laid her on the bed. "This is Mrs. Wilkes," he explained. "She helps keep house for me. She'll get you cleaned up. The doctor." Grace whispered. A shadow crossed Hank's face. "Doc Thompson's away at Fort Smith until tomorrow. Mrs. Wilkes has tended more wounds than most doctors anyway." Mrs. Wilkes shooed him from the room. "Get on now. Let me see to the poor girl." The next hour was a blur of pain as Mrs. Wilkes cleaned Grace's wounds, bandaged her ribs, and helped her into a clean nightgown. "3 cracked ribs, I reckon," the older woman said. "That head wound isn't as bad as it looked, thank the Lord. Head wounds always bleed something fierce. You've got bruises aplenty, but nothing that won't heal." Grace tried to thank her, but exhaustion claimed her before she could form the words. When she woke again, morning light was streaming through the curtains. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or how she'd gotten there. Then the pain in her ribs reminded her. A soft knock at the door preceded Mrs. Wilkes entering with a tray. "You're awake. Good. I've brought some broth and tea." "What time is it?" Grace asked, her voice hoarse. "Just past 9. You slept through the night and half the morning." Mrs. Wilkes helped her sit up against the pillows. "Hank's been worried something fierce." "Mr. Dawson has been very kind," Grace said, accepting the cup of tea. "I don't know how to thank him." "That boy doesn't need thanks. Just doing what any decent man would do." Mrs. Wilkes arranged the tray. "Though I've never seen him so rattled as when he brought you in." Grace sipped the tea, its warmth spreading through her. "I was traveling to Monticello. I'm supposed to be the new schoolteacher there." "Monticello?" Mrs. Wilkes exclaimed. "Why, that's just 15 miles south of here." "Hank does business there regular." Another knock interrupted them, and Hank himself appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. He'd shaved, Grace noticed, and changed his rain-soaked clothes. He looked younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so. "Miss Abbott," he said, nodding. "Good to see you awake." "Mr. Dawson," she replied. "I can't begin to thank you for what you've done." He shook his head. "No need for that. I sent one of my hands to Monticello with a message for the school board, letting them know what happened and that you're safe." Grace felt tears welling in her eyes. That was very thoughtful. "Sheriff Calloway will be riding out later today," Hank continued. "He'll want your description of the bandits." "Of course," Grace agreed, though the thought of reliving the attack made her stomach clench. "You rest now," he said, backing toward the door. "Doc Thompson will be by this evening to check on you proper." After he left, Mrs. Wilkes chuckled. "Never seen that boy so tongue-tied around a lady before." "He seems very kind," Grace said cautiously. "Kind doesn't begin to cover it." "Hank Dawson's the best man in these parts. Came here 8 years ago with nothing but his horse and saddle. Built this place up from scratch." Mrs. Wilkes adjusted Grace's pillows. "Now he's got one of the finest small cattle operations in the county." Over the next few days, Grace learned more about her rescuer. Hank had grown up in Missouri, the son of a blacksmith. After the war, he'd worked cattle drives from Texas until he saved enough to buy his own land. He wasn't a man of many words, but what he did say carried weight with the local folks. Dr. Thompson confirmed Mrs. Wilkes' assessment of Grace's injuries and prescribed rest for at least 2 weeks before attempting the final journey to Monticello. The school board sent word that her position would be held, with classes delayed until her arrival. As she recovered, Grace began to venture from her room, first to sit on the porch in the sunshine, then to help Mrs. Wilkes with small tasks in the kitchen. Hank was often absent during the day, tending to his cattle or riding the boundaries of his property, but he always returned for supper. At first, their conversations were stilted and formal, but gradually, a cautious friendship began to form. Grace learned that Hank loved books. His small shelf held volumes of Twain, Dickens, and Whitman, and he confessed that, as a boy, he dreamed of attending university back east. "Life had other plans," he said with a shrug one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "But I don't regret the path I've taken." "Neither do I," Grace replied softly, surprising herself with the truth of it. The attack had been horrific, but meeting Hank and Mrs. Wilkes felt strangely like finding a piece of home she hadn't known was missing. A week into her stay, Sheriff Calloway returned with news. The bandits had been captured trying to rob a bank in Pine Bluff. They'll stand trial in Little Rock, he informed her. Most likely hang for the stagecoach murders. Grace nodded, feeling not satisfaction but a kind of hollow relief. Justice would be served, but it wouldn't bring back the dead or erase her nightmares. That night, she woke screaming, the bandits' faces vivid in her dreams. Before Mrs. Wilkes could reach her, Hank was there, awkwardly patting her shoulder as she sobbed. "I keep seeing them," she confessed. "Every time I close my eyes." "It'll fade," he said quietly. "Not completely maybe, but enough that you can sleep again." Something in his voice made her wonder what demons visited his dreams. "The war?" she asked gently. He nodded, his face half hidden in shadow. "Served with the 5th Missouri, saw things no man should see." They sat in silence until her tears subsided. Before he left, he squeezed her hand once, the gesture worth 1,000 words. As the days passed, Grace found herself watching for Hank's return each evening, her heart quickening at the sound of his boots on the porch steps. She told herself it was merely gratitude, but Mrs. Wilkes' knowing looks suggested the older woman saw more than Grace wanted to admit. "You know," Mrs. Wilkes said casually one morning as they kneaded bread dough, "Hank's never brought anyone here before. Not in all the years I've kept house for him." "I was hardly a social call," Grace pointed out. "The man found me dying. Mrs. Wilkes hummed noncommittally. "Still, he could have taken you straight to town." 2 weeks after her arrival, Dr. Thompson declared Grace fit for travel to Monticello. The school board had arranged lodging with the mayor's widowed sister, and classes were scheduled to begin the following Monday. "I'll drive you to town tomorrow," Hank offered at dinner that evening. His voice was carefully neutral, but Grace thought she detected reluctance. "Thank you," she replied, equally formal. "You and Mrs. Wilkes have shown me such kindness. I wish there was some way to repay you." "No need," Hank said, rising abruptly. "Excuse me. I need to check on a new calf." After he'd gone, Mrs. Wilkes sighed heavily. "That boy is as stubborn as they come." "What do you mean?" Grace asked. "He's sweet on you, child. Has been since he carried you through that door." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "That's absurd. He barely knows me." "Sometimes knowing comes quick," the older woman said. "My Henry asked me to marry him 3 days after we met. We had 42 good years before the Lord took him." That night, Grace couldn't sleep. The thought of leaving the ranch, leaving Hank, filled her with an unexpected sadness. She'd built a life in her mind, teaching in Monticello, boarding with the mayor's sister, perhaps eventually saving enough for a small place of her own. It had seemed so right and proper when she left Little Rock. Now she wasn't so certain. Just before dawn, she slipped out onto the porch, wrapped in a shawl Mrs. Wilkes had loaned her. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, and the air was cool with the promise of autumn. She didn't hear Hank approach until he spoke. "You're up early," Grace startled. "I couldn't sleep." He leaned against the porch railing, his profile strong against the lightening sky. "Having second thoughts about Monticello?" "No," she said quickly. Then, more honestly, "Maybe." Hank was quiet for a long moment. "You'd make a fine teacher. Those children would be lucky to have you." "Thank you," Grace whispered. But he hesitated, then plunged ahead. "There's a school here too, closer to the river. They're looking for a teacher as well." Grace's heart quickened. "Is that so?" "It's smaller. The pay wouldn't be as good, but it's only 3 miles from here." He turned to face her, his expression earnest. "You could stay on here if you wanted to." "Stay here." "With you and Mrs. Wilkes." "With me," he clarified. "Mrs. Wilkes has been talking about moving to Fort Smith to live with her daughter." Has been for years, truth be told, but didn't want to leave me bachelor keeping. He took a deep breath. I know it's sudden. We've only known each other a short while, but I think I feel yes, Grace said, her voice stronger than she expected. Hank blinked. Yes, just like that, she smiled. Not as a housekeeper, Mr. Dawson, if that's what you're asking. It's not, he said quickly. I mean, I hadn't dared hope. He ran a hand through his hair. I'm making a mess of this. Perhaps you should just say what's in your heart, Grace suggested gently. Hank took both her hands in his. Miss Abbott, Grace, I know we've not had time for a proper courtship, but when I found you by that river, something changed in me. I'd like the chance to court you proper. And yes, eventually, if you'll have me, to make you my wife. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. I thought it was just me, she admitted, feeling this way so quickly. It's not just you, he assured her. Their first kiss was tentative, sweet with the promise of more to come. As the sun crested the horizon, painting the sky in pinks and golds, Grace knew with certainty that the riverbank where Hank had found her wasn't an ending, but a beginning. That morning, Hank rode to Monticello alone, carrying Grace's regretful letter to the school board. He returned with news that the River Valley School would be delighted to hire Miss Abbott as their teacher, beginning the following week. It's settled then, Grace said, relief and happiness making her voice tremble. I'll stay. The courtship that followed was proper but swift. Hank escorted Grace to church each Sunday, where the local families welcomed her warmly. On Saturday afternoons, they rode together across his property, Hank proudly pointing out improvements he planned for the coming year. Mrs. Wilkes watched their blossoming romance with satisfaction. Told you so, she would murmur to Grace when Hank wasn't listening. Grace began teaching at the small schoolhouse near the river, walking the 3 miles each way when weather permitted. Her 18 students ranged from 6 to 16 years of age, and though resources were scarce compared to city schools, their eagerness to learn compensated for any lack of materials. As autumn progressed toward winter, Mrs. Wilkes finally made good on her long-standing plan to join her daughter in Fort Smith. Before leaving, she took Grace aside. You'll be needing a chaperone with me gone, she said practically. Unless, of course, there's to be a wedding soon. Grace blushed. Hank hasn't formally asked yet. Men need a little nudging sometimes, Mrs. Wilkes advised with a wink. Don't let propriety stand in the way of happiness. After Mrs. Wilkes departed, Grace moved to the schoolteacher's cabin, a small but comfortable structure near the schoolhouse. The arrangement was respectable, but Grace found herself missing the warmth of Hank's home and his company in the evenings. The first snow of December arrived early, blanketing the hills in white. Grace was collecting kindling when Hank rode up, his horse leaving deep tracks in the fresh snow. Thought you might need supplies, he called, dismounting with a burlap sack of provisions. Inside her cabin, as they warmed themselves by the fire, Hank seemed unusually nervous. Is something wrong? Grace asked. Not wrong, he said, reaching into his coat pocket. Just important. The ring he produced was simple, a gold band with a small pearl, but to Grace, it was perfect. I had it made in Little Rock, he explained. Didn't trust the local jeweler to keep quiet about it. It's beautiful, she whispered. Grace Abbott, Hank said formally, dropping to one knee before her. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Yes, she answered without hesitation. With all my heart, yes. They were married on Christmas Eve in the small church in River Valley, with Mrs. Wilkes returning for the occasion. The entire community turned out to celebrate, the schoolchildren presenting their teacher with a handmade quilt for her new home. I told the children I'd be Mrs. Dawson after Christmas, Grace said, as Hank drove their wagon home through gently falling snow. Little Mary asked if I'd still be their teacher. "And what did you tell her?" Hank asked, tucking the blanket more securely around her. "That I would always be their teacher, but now I'd be teaching from a happier heart." Their wedding night was everything Grace had dreamed of: tender, passionate, and filled with discoveries about each other that could only come with this new intimacy. As they lay tangled in each other's arms, Grace marveled at the path that had brought her here. "I keep thinking about that day by the river," she murmured. "How close I came to dying there." Hank's arms tightened around her. "God had other plans for you, for us. It seems impossible that something so horrible could lead to such happiness." "Not impossible," he said, kissing her forehead. "Just unlikely, like finding a pearl in an ordinary oyster." Spring came early that year, bringing with it new calves in the pastures and the promise of a bountiful harvest to come. Grace continued teaching, but now she rode to school on a gentle mare Hank had trained especially for her. In late April, as wildflowers carpeted the hillsides, Grace confirmed what she'd suspected for weeks. They would welcome their first child before the year's end. Hank's reaction to the news was everything she'd hoped for: joy, wonder, and just a touch of masculine pride. That evening he took her back to the riverbank where he'd found her. "I wanted to show you something," he said, leading her to a young oak tree he'd planted near the water's edge. "I put this here last autumn after you agreed to stay." Grace touched the small tree's leaves. "A memorial." "Not exactly. More like a marker of beginnings." He wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands resting protectively over their unborn child. "This spot will always be sacred to me, Grace, not because of what almost happened, but because of what did happen. I found you." "And I found you," she said, turning in his embrace. "My rescuer. My love." As the years passed, the Dawson family grew, first with the arrival of their son Benjamin in November, then their daughter Elizabeth 2 years later. The oak tree by the riverbank grew as well, its branches stretching higher each season. Hank expanded his ranch, adding new pasture land and improving the breeding stock until the Dawson brand was known throughout Arkansas for quality. Grace eventually hired another teacher to share her duties, allowing her more time with her family while still pursuing the vocation she loved. Each year on the anniversary of their meeting, they visited the riverbank together. It became a family tradition, with the children hearing the story of how their father had found their mother just in time, as little Benjamin liked to say. On the 10th anniversary, they brought a picnic. While the children played nearby under the watchful eye of Rusty's successor, a collie named Scout Hank and Grace sat beneath the oak, now tall enough to provide proper shade. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't ridden by that evening?" Grace asked, her head resting on his shoulder. "No," Hank answered honestly. "Some things aren't meant for wondering about, they're too dark to dwell on." "You're right," she agreed. "Better to focus on what did happen." He picked up her hand, kissing the gold band that had never left her finger. 10 years. Sometimes it feels like yesterday I found you here. And sometimes it feels like I've loved you my whole life," she replied. In the distance, Benjamin's laughter rang out as he chased his sister through a field of wildflowers. The river flowed peacefully beside them, so different from the angry, rain-swollen waters of that fateful day. "I have something for you," Hank said, reaching into his pocket. He handed her a small wooden box carved with their initials. Inside, Grace found a delicate gold locket, an exact replica of the one the bandits had stolen a decade earlier. "Oh, Hank," she breathed. "How did you described it once," he said. "I had a jeweler in St. Louis make it from your description." Tears filled her eyes as she opened it to find miniature portraits of Benjamin and Elizabeth inside. "It's perfect." "Not quite," Hank said, producing a small piece of paper. "This goes in the back compartment." Grace unfolded it to find a tiny pencil sketch Hank's work. She knew of the riverbank and the oak tree. "So you'll always remember," he said softly, "as if I could ever forget." She kissed him, pouring 10 years of love and gratitude into the embrace. That evening, as they rode home with their sleepy children, Grace looked back at the river glinting in the sunset. The young woman she had been frightened, alone, close to death, seemed like a character from someone else's story now. Yet without that woman's suffering, without the cruelty that had left her by the riverbank to die, she wouldn't have the life she cherished now. It was a mystery she'd long ago stopped trying to solve, accepting instead that sometimes life's darkest moments led to its greatest joys. "What are you thinking about?" Hank asked, noticing her pensive expression. Grace smiled, turning back to her family, to the future that stretched before them as wide and promising as the Arkansas sky. "I was thinking about rivers," she said. "How they carry us to places we never expected to go." "Like home," Hank suggested. "Yes," Grace agreed, her heart full. "Exactly like home.